The air on Novgorod 7 was crisp with the bite of an oncoming frost, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The settlement, a scattering of steel-framed buildings pressed against the foot of the mountains, bustled with quiet industry. Men hauled supply crates, engineers adjusted thermal regulators, and children wove between their parents' legs in energetic bursts before being corralled back into place. Among them was Yuri Petrovich, his breath curling in the cold as he ran ahead of his father, excitement propelling his small frame forward. "Ivan, he's going to outpace you at this rate," called one of the older colonists with a chuckle, watching the boy dart through the thinning crowd. Ivan Petrovich, standing a full head taller than most men in the colony, walked at an unhurried pace. His expression, carved from years of discipline, softened only slightly as he watched his son. "Let him run," he replied. "A man should test his limits while he's still young enough to heal from the lessons." Yuri turned back, beaming. His father's words were always laced with something more, lessons wrapped in steel. At 10, he understood little of what lay beneath them. But he carried them as carefully as the knife his father had given him on his last birthday. The settlement's daily rhythm faltered as a low, guttural hum filled the air, a vibration felt more than heard. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the dirt roads as a Krell warship descended, its blackened hull blocking out the sun. It landed just beyond the colony's perimeter, displacing dust and frost, sending a ripple of unease through the gathered humans. Conversations hushed, movement stilled. Even the children, still too young to fully grasp what it meant, sensed something was wrong. Ivan stopped walking. His jaw tightened, and his fingers curled slightly, instinct stirring like a long-dormant predator waking to familiar prey. The Krell had come before. Their presence was not new. Their demands for tribute, for labor, for submission had become an unspoken part of life on Novgorod 7. The governor, a man with more spine in his words than in his actions, had long since decided that compliance meant survival. The warship's hatch hissed open, and from its depths emerged Commander Zelthrak, his towering, sinewy form framed against the darkness of his vessel's interior. His mandibles clicked in amusement as he stepped forward, his soldiers fanning out behind him, their weapons slung lazily over their shoulders. They did not expect resistance. The crowd parted, and the colonial mayor, stout, sweating, barely holding himself together, stumbled forward. "Commander," he began, voice uneven, "we were not expecting you so soon." Zelthrak's deep-set eyes swept over the gathered humans as if he were examining livestock, his nostrils flaring at the scent of them. "Your expectations mean nothing," he replied. "Our demands are simple. You will provide what is owed." The words had weight, pressing down on the people, like an invisible hand tightening around their throats. This was not a negotiation. It never was. Yuri, still standing ahead of his father, narrowed his eyes at the alien commander. He had heard the whispers, the late-night discussions when men spoke, in low voices, thinking their children too tired to listen. He had seen the weariness on his father's face when these creatures came, the way good men stood still and did nothing. He stepped forward. "You think you can just take whatever you want?" His voice, though small against the vastness of the warship and the hulking figures before him, carried a sharpness that made several people inhale sharply. A ripple of tension moved through the gathered crowd. Ivan's eyes flicked to his son, the only movement he made, but inside, something cold twisted in his gut. Zelthrak turned his gaze downward, studying the boy with something resembling amusement. "And what is this? A cub with teeth?" He crouched slightly, bringing his face level with Yuri's. "Shall I be afraid?" Yuri did not move. "Maybe," he said, "if you knew what my father was." Silence. It stretched long, uneasy. Ivan had taught his son many things, but he had never spoken of the past, not in any way Yuri could have understood. And yet, something had slipped through, enough for the boy to speak without knowing the weight of his words. Zelthrak let out a low, rumbling laugh, rising to his full height. "A warrior's spawn, then? Perhaps you will grow into something worthy of fear." He glanced at Ivan, a slow smile spreading across his face, an expression of something cruel and knowing. Or perhaps not. The conversation should have ended there. The colony had seen posturing before. It was a dance between the strong and the desperate, the kind of display where survival depended on swallowing pride and keeping heads bowed. But then one of the Krell soldiers, either eager to impress or simply cruel by nature, stepped forward and struck the boy. The sound was sharp, final. Yuri crumpled, a gasp torn from the crowd, and before anyone could react, the alien's blade followed. The steel found flesh. A small, choked sound escaped the boy's lips, his body twisting, crumpling into the dirt. Time fractured. The world, moments ago loud with breath, with movement, with life, became hollow, a vacuum where nothing existed except the sight of red blooming across the frost-covered ground. A scream tried to form in Ivan's throat, but it never came. His breath froze. His body locked. Zelfrak exhaled through his mandibles, stepping back as if surveying an inconvenience. "A lesson," he said, his voice almost bored, "so that the rest of you will remember your place." No one moved. No one spoke. The alien commander turned, gesturing to his men. The Krell began to move back toward their ship, as if this was nothing, as if they had simply dropped cargo and were now ready to leave. Ivan knelt beside his son's body. His hands, so steady in battle, trembled as they touched the cooling skin. He could hear his heartbeat, slow, deliberate, a drumbeat of something rising inside him, something dark and ancient, something he had buried beneath years of forced peace. His son's knife lay beside him, its blade still clean, untouched by war. Ivan picked it up. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. Not again. He did not shout. He did not weep. He simply stood, tucking the blade into his belt, and, in the eyes of those who saw him rise, there was no mistaking it. The man they had known was gone. The thing that remained, Baba Yaga, had returned. The wind howled through the pines, rattling against the cabin's thick wooden walls. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth cast flickering shadows against rough-hewn furniture, illuminating the figure seated at the worn wooden table. Ivan Petrovich sat motionless, the only sound in the room the slow, rhythmic sharpening of a blade against a whetstone. Metal whispered against stone, over and over, steady as a heartbeat. Yuri's knife. It was small in his hands, a child's blade, meant for carving wood or cutting through simple tasks. Not for war. Not for defense. Not for stopping the inevitable. His fingers tightened around the hilt, his breath shallow. He had not spoken since he carried his son's body through the silent streets of Novgorod 7. No one had tried to stop him. No one had offered comfort. They had only watched, their grief wrapped in fear, their silence a confession. They had given up long ago. A knock at the door. Not hesitant, but firm, deliberate. Ivan didn't move. The door swung open, and a broad-shouldered man stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. His face, lined from years of war and wear, remained unreadable as he closed the door behind him. "Mikhail Orlov. Should have figured you'd come out here," Mikhail said, glancing around the cabin. His eyes landed on the blade in Ivan's hands, the worn edge now gleaming in the firelight. "I heard what happened." Ivan said nothing. Mikhail exhaled, rubbing a calloused hand over his stubbled jaw. He took a step forward, then stopped, studying the man before him. "Tell me you're not thinking what I know you're thinking." Still silence. Mikhail swore under his breath. "Ivan." He crossed the room, pulled out a chair, and dropped into it with a heavy thud. "I know what's in your head, but you need to hear this." "No," Ivan said, the single word cutting through the air like a blade. His voice was quiet but final, a voice from another life. Mikhail's jaw tightened. He had seen that look before, years ago, in the blood-soaked ruins of another world. The look of a man who had already decided. "Ivan," he tried again, voice low, careful. "You don't have to do this." Ivan lifted the knife, turning it slowly in his grip, watching the firelight play along the blade's edge. "No," he said again, softer this time. "I don't." He set the knife down and stood. The chair scraped against the wooden floor, the sound somehow heavier than it should have been. Then he moved to the corner of the cabin, to a chest that had remained closed for too many years. He crouched, ran a hand over the scarred surface, and unlatched it. The lid creaked open, revealing what he had tried so long to bury. Weapons, knives, pistols, compact explosives, a rifle with a stock worn smooth from use, and beneath it all a long, tattered coat, its reinforced fabric still dark with old stains. Mikhail let out a slow breath. You swore you were done. I was. Ivan reached in, pulling out the coat. The weight of it settled over his hands, over his shoulders, like an old friend. But they took my son. Mikhail looked away for a moment, exhaling through his nose. We always knew this would happen eventually, he muttered. Ivan slid a knife into his belt. They think we are weak. Mikhail's hands curled into fists. We are weak. Or, at least, the colony is. He gestured vaguely toward the door. They won't fight back. They're scared. Ivan turned, meeting his gaze. His voice was calm, even. Then I will remind them what fear really is. Mikhail stared at him, then shook his head, standing. You know what happens next. The Krell won't just let you kill a few of their men and walk away. If you do this, it won't stop until one of you is wiped out. Ivan pulled on his gloves, tightening the straps at the wrists. Good. Mikhail let out a dry, humorless chuckle. They have a garrison, Ivan. You're one man. A pause. Then Ivan met his eyes with something darker than certainty. I am Baba Yaga. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of history, of whispered fear in enemy camps, of the things men spoke of only in the dark. Mikhail let the silence stretch before shaking his head. Damn fool. But there was something else in his voice now. Something like respect. Ivan reached into the chest one last time and pulled out a blacked-out pistol, its grip molded perfectly to his hand. He checked the chamber, then holstered it with practiced ease. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Mikhail watched him go, exhaling slowly. He had known, from the moment he entered this cabin, that there would be no stopping this. The war had never truly left Ivan. Now, it had simply come knocking again. The Krell did not fear the dark. They were predators, towering beasts of muscle and exoskeletal plating, their vision adapted for the deepest voids of space. To them, darkness was merely an absence of lesser creatures. It was where they hunted, where they thrived. But tonight, something was in the dark that did not belong. Sergeant Vorkal of the Krell Dominion garrison shifted uneasily as he patrolled the perimeter of the outpost. The compound was nothing more than a crude fortification of prefabricated walls and sentry turrets, a place to remind the human settlers of their place. Normally, he took pride in his post. Humans were weak, fearful, easily broken. Yet tonight, an unease gnawed at him. The others felt it too. The air was too still, the wind too quiet. The forest that bordered the settlement, usually alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, was silent. He tightened his grip on his plasma rifle. Something moved, a flicker at the edge of his vision, gone before his mind could register it. Vorkal turned, scanning the darkness, his mandibles clicking in irritation. The others had noticed it now. The sentry shifted, uneasy, scanning the tree-line. Then the lights went out. All at once, the floodlights positioned around the compound flickered, sputtered, and died, plunging the outpost into blackness. The turrets powered down. A brief electrical whine filled the air before being swallowed by silence. The Krell froze. Then came the first scream. It was short, cut off as suddenly as it had begun. The sentries turned, weapons raised, but the night swallowed everything. No body, no struggle, just absence. Vorkal snarled, snapping orders into his communicator. Find the intruder. Fan out and... Another scream. Closer this time. A dull, wet sound followed, something heavy hitting the ground. Vorkal's blood ran cold. The communicator crackled. Command! Something's in the compound. We need... The voice cut out with a sharp, gargled noise, followed by static. A shadow moved. Vorkal spun, firing wildly, plasma rounds illuminating the darkness in bursts of green light. The shots struck nothing. Something grabbed the sentry beside him. The Krell barely had time to react before the soldier was yanked into the darkness, vanishing with a strangled cry. The others fired in all directions, blind and panicked, but there was nothing to shoot. Then Vorkal saw him. A figure stepped into the flickering light of a burning console. A human, but not like the others. This one moved with something ancient in his step, something practiced and methodical. His face was carved from stone, his eyes cold, empty. He did not run. He did not hide. He walked, and in his hands he carried death. The pistol in his grip barked once, and the Krell nearest to him staggered back, a hole between his eyes. The silenced shot barely registered before another followed. Another soldier dropped. Vorkal roared, raising his rifle. Too slow. The human was already moving. A blade flashed in the firelight, steel catching the glow for the briefest moment before it found flesh. A Krell gurgled, clutching at his throat as dark blood spilled through his claws. The human did not pause. He flowed forward, weaving between them like a shadow given form. Vorkal fired again, but the human was gone, ducking low, rolling beneath the shot. A knife buried itself into the thigh of another soldier, twisting, severing muscle. A gunshot followed. Another body hit the ground. Panic spread. These were warriors, trained enforcers of the Dominion, and yet they were dying like cattle, one by one, to a single man. This was not a man. This was something else. Something worse. Vorkal stumbled back, his mind clawing for reason, for understanding. This was impossible. No human fought like this. No human could do this. Then he saw the eyes. Cold, dead, unrelenting. Recognition slammed into him like a hammer. The stories, the whispers among the veterans of the Dominion, of those who had fought in the old wars, of a name spoken in fear. Not a name, a title. His breath caught in his throat. Baba Yaga. The human's gaze locked onto him. Vorkal ran. He did not think, did not command his men. He simply turned and bolted for the central tower, slamming his fist against the emergency override. The doors slid open, and he stumbled inside, gasping for breath as he sealed the entrance behind him. His mind raced. He needed reinforcements. A hand gripped his shoulder. Cold, ironclad. Vorkal barely had time to turn before the blade entered his chest. The pain was distant, a fading thing, as he looked down to see steel embedded between his ribs. His breath hitched, mandibles twitching as he tried to form words. The human leaned in, voice a whisper of death. You took my son. Darkness took him. The hunt had begun. The Krell warship loomed above the colony, its blackened hull a blot against the starlit sky. Inside its command chamber, Commander Zelthrak stood motionless, his heavy hands resting on the carved stone railing that overlooked the hollow display of the planet below. His mandibles clicked in irritation. Reports had been coming in for the past hour, each more troubling than the last. A human had attacked the garrison. Not a band of rebels. Not an insurgent cell. A single human. And his soldiers were dying. Zelthrak exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing against him. This was not how things were meant to be. The humans of Novgorod 7 were weak, their spirits broken long before his arrival. They had surrendered their freedom in silence, exchanging defiance for survival. They had been taught that resistance was futile. So, why? Now, did one among them choose to rise? The chamber doors hissed open, and a battered soldier stumbled inside, his armor scorched, his breathing labored. My lord, the Krell barely held himself upright, black blood seeping from a gash along his side. He is still out there. Zelthrak turned, his yellow eyes narrowing. How many have fallen? The soldier hesitated. Too many. Zelthrak's mandibles flared in disgust. It is one man, he growled. One human. The soldier swallowed hard. He moves like a ghost. He strikes before we can see him. He does not hesitate. He does not stop. Zelthrak stepped forward, looming over the wounded warrior. You are Krell. You do not fear prey. The soldier's throat worked, his gaze flickering toward the floor. This one is not prey. Zelthrak's claws flexed against the railing. He had seen battle against the human race before. They were reckless short-lived creatures, driven by impulse and emotion rather than strategy. They fought bravely, but bravery without strength was useless. The Dominion had crushed them once, and they would do so again. But this one, the title had been whispered through the ranks, carried by dying breaths and broken voices. Baba Yaga. Zelfrak had never believed in myths. Stories were weapons of the weak, tools to inspire courage where there was none. But something about the way his warriors spoke the name made him pause. He had made a mistake. He should have put the boy's father down the moment the child fell, should have crushed whatever embers of resistance might have smoldered in the man's heart. Instead, he had allowed him to walk away, had thought the grief alone would be enough to cripple him. He had underestimated the depth of human wrath. Zelfrak straightened, summoned the war council. We end this now. The soldier hesitated, then nodded, limping from the chamber. Zelfrak turned back to the hollow display. The outpost below was burning, Krell bodies littering the ground. One man had done this. No, not a man. A monster of his own making. The warship's corridors were silent. Not the stillness of order, but the hushed breath before a storm. Krell warriors lined the halls, their plasma rifles charged, their armored forms tense beneath the dim red glow of emergency lighting. The alarms had long since gone silent. There was no need for them anymore. Every Krell aboard knew what had come for them. Zelfrak stood at the heart of the warship's command center, his claws tightening around the ornate handle of his ceremonial blade. He did not carry it for tradition anymore. Now, it was a weapon of necessity. The human had breached the ship, not an army, not a strike force, one man, and he had come for vengeance. A distant explosion rattled the chamber. The security feed flickered, grainy images of blood-slicked corridors flashing across the displays. Warriors lay where they had fallen, their weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. The airlocks had been sealed, the bulkheads reinforced, but it had not mattered. He had found a way in. Zelfrak's mandibles twitched. This should have been impossible. The Krell were the Dominion's enforcers, an apex species bred for war. Yet this one human had turned their strength against them, turning their own warship into a tomb. The doors to the command center shuddered. Every Krell in the room turned, weapons raised. The reinforced metal groaned as something struck from the other side. Not a blast, not an explosion, just the steady, relentless force of something determined. Then the door buckled. Zelfrak drew his blade. The final blow sent the heavy doors screeching open. Smoke billowed into the chamber, the emergency lights casting flickering shadows through the haze. And then through the swirling fog he stepped forward. The human. His long coat was dark with blood. Some of it his, most of it not. A rifle hung at his side, emptied. His pistol sat holstered, untouched. In his hand he carried only a knife, its edge reflecting the crimson glow of the room. He did not speak. He did not need to. The Krell opened fire. The room erupted in plasma, the air filling with the burning stench of scorched metal and ozone. The human moved like a phantom, weaving through the hail of fire with inhuman precision. The first Krell fell before he even realized the human had reached him. The knife slid between the plates of his armor, twisting, finding the gap between bone and muscle. The second went down a heartbeat later, his throat opened before he could cry out. Zelfrak roared, charging forward, his blade arcing toward the human skull. The man shifted, stepping inside the strike, and Zelfrak felt cold steel bury itself beneath his ribs. Pain. He staggered, but his grip tightened on his weapon. With a bellow, he swung again. The human caught his wrist. A gunshot. The blade clattered to the ground, Zelfrak's arms suddenly numb. He looked down, confusion flickering through his mind as he saw the bullet hole clean through his wrist. The human ripped the knife from his side, stepping back. Zelfrak fell to one knee, his breath shuddering. The others were dead. The chamber was silent once more. The human crouched before him, eyes empty, soulless. "You took my son." The words were quiet, steady. Zelfrak opened his mandibles to speak, to plead, to say anything. The knife flashed, darkness swallowed him, and Baba Yaga stood alone.